Hi and welcome to my channel. My name is Beth and I am the Bookworm Trait. And today I am bringing you my March wrap up. March was a bit of a weird month for me. I spent all of March feeling like I was in a reading slump, but then when I came to look at my books at the end of the month, I read 12 books. So this is going to be a long video. Because of how long I think this video might be, I am potentially going to split it into two parts, so you guys will know whether I did that or not because it will be in the description of the video. But let's see, let's get into it, let's find out what I read in March. As I always do with my wrap-ups, I will start with the books that I liked the least or that I DNF'd and work up to my 5-star reads. So in March I DNF'd 3 books. I had 1 1-star read, my first for the year. I had 2 2-star reads, 2 3-star reads, 2 4-star reads, and 3 5-star reads. I also read 2 non-fiction books, which I haven't rated because I don't really know how to go about that. Now, if you have been counting along, you might realise that what I just said is more than 12 books. There are 2 DNFs that I'm not going to talk about in this video because they were rereads, and that is Bunny, which I DNF'd because I was just tired, but previously I have given Bunny 5 stars, and The Wicked King, which I DNF'd because I just wasn't in the mood for it, and I gave that book initially 4 stars. I'm not going to talk about them in this wrap up because it is long enough as it is, so we're just not going to get into it. I'm also only going to briefly mention one of the non-fiction books I read, which was Save the Cat Writes a Novel. This is a guide to plotting a novel, and I just don't really want to talk about it in this video because there isn't much I can say other than this is really useful and helpful guide if you are someone who likes writing, is interested in starting writing, or someone who is already a writer and needs or wants help in actually outlining their novels. Then I would really highly recommend this. This was really good and really helpful and a really easy quick read too. So getting into the actual books that I am going to discuss in this video, the first one I'm going to talk about is the other non-fiction book I read, which was Fearing the Black Body. I think this might be the first non-fiction book that I have ever finished that wasn't to do with writing. So this was an audiobook that I listened to on Scribd, and I think for me that's going to be the way that I absorb non-fiction because I don't think I could have sat down and read this book. Just because of me and my attention span, like I think I'll have to go down the route of listening to audiobooks with non-fiction, but it is something that I would like to continue trying to absorb more of, and I am going to try going forward to read at least 1 non-fiction book a month, although I may not do that in the month of April because I am doing NaNoWriMo, which has taken a huge amount of time. So anyway, talking about Fearing the Black Body, I really enjoyed this. I thought it was incredibly interesting. The premise of the book is an exploration into what has been deemed as attractive throughout history and the effect that globalization, the slave trade, religion, wealth and improvements in healthcare have all had in aesthetic. I thought this was really interesting, but I don't know that I necessarily agreed with the conclusions that the author came to in that fat phobia is intrinsically racist. For me, listening to the evidence that she put forward, I definitely think that Black people have always been vilified as being ugly, and have always been used to demonstrate whatever the opposite of beautiful is. Well, not always, but a lot. But I just feel a little bit uncomfortable with saying that fat phobia is racist. I just don't think it's accurate. I don't necessarily even believe that was the main point of the book, and in some ways it felt like that was being used to kind of, dare I say, sell it, because she also talks a lot about how negative body stereotypes have been used to describe other groups, such as undesirable white groups too, like Irish people. It's definitely an absolutely fascinating read and I would highly recommend it. It does bring up a lot of interesting topics around just fatness in general and the way that it has been used to control women. And basically it just tells you that white men are crazy and just someone needs to sit them down and have a word with them and just be like, guys, you don't own women's bodies. I may rate my non-fiction books in the future. I just need to like read some more so I know how I want to rate them. Like, do I rate this high because it was interesting, or do I mark it down because I didn't necessarily agree with the overall conclusion drawn by the information that she presented? I don't know. I don't know how to go about rating it. If you read non-fiction books and you rate them, then please let me know what you do in the comments down below, because I don't know. So let's go into my DNFs. So the only DNF that I will be talking about in this video is If We Were Villains, which I read as part of a buddy read, and it feels like I read this 2 years ago. Like, it doesn't feel like I DNF'd this recently. Now, if you've been here a while, you probably already know that I'm the kind of person who DNFs books all the time. I think it is a really good practice to get into. I highly recommend it. It will improve your overall reading experience by 1,000,000%. That is an accurate and researched statistic. I don't DNF books necessarily because I don't like them though, and that was definitely the case with If We Were Villains. It's definitely a book that I want to go back into. So If We Were Villains is a very famous dark academia book, and it follows a group of Shakespeare students. It's written in 2 timelines. So we have one timeline where our main character is getting out of prison and is talking to the detective about what happened the summer that one of his friends was murdered, and then the other timeline is actually the summer that his friend was murdered. I'm saying summer, I don't actually know if it was in the summer, I don't remember, but whenever, the period of time in which his friend was murdered. This is a very Marmite book. People either love it or they hate it. I don't know where I fall on that spectrum. I thought this was an incredibly well written book, and I thought the characters were absolutely deplorable, but I enjoyed that about them. I'm someone who adores morally grey and evil characters. I've always been drawn to a good villain. Like, I love a baddie. I love a baddie. And so that was very enjoyable for me to just be around the just intensely dislikable characters. I thought the overall plot from what I read of it was intriguing. I was definitely intrigued to see where the story went. But this is an intense book. The story is intense, the characters are intense, and the writing is intense. And I could not focus. I think partially the method that I was reading this book didn't help as well. So I started off reading the audiobook and I just couldn't connect to the audiobook. It happens sometimes. Some audiobooks I'm just like, no, this is not the one for me. It's not a criticism of the audiobook or the narrator. I actually thought it was quite a good audiobook. It just, we weren't vibing. I then switched to ebook and that wasn't working for me either. I typically read easy books as ebooks. These are usually a book that I will read late at night before I go to sleep, and so I don't read anything that's too like emotionally draining or mentally draining, because that's not what I want before I go to sleep. So I think that the way that I was absorbing the story didn't help, as well as me just not really being in the right mind frame for such an intense book. Will I go back and read this book? I hope so, but I will have to physically purchase this book to do that, and it's not at the top of my list of books that I've DNF'd and want to get to, or books that I want to purchase. So if I do, it won't be anytime soon. So moving on to my 1-star read, I very, very rarely give books 1 star. I think I've only ever given one book a 1-star rating before, and it was because it was incredibly problematic. And I'm not talking like, oh, it may or may not have been racist. I'm talking, it promoted paedophilia. So like, yeah. And I'm not saying like I wouldn't 1-star a racist book, but I just feel like there are levels to problematicness, and that is the lowest of all the levels. We won't talk about that. I've talked about that in previous videos. I don't want to talk about that book because it A, makes me angry, and B, I don't want to promote it. And this book that I gave 1 star, it was not problematic at all. It was just not good. So this book was New World. I read this for Becca's Bookoplathon, and I read it because I thought it was a standalone fantasy romance novella, and it wasn't. It was part of a serialized series. So just something to bear in mind, that I don't have the entire story, and I did kind of feel hesitant about rating this at all. But I just thought, would I want to continue with this series? Slash, if I was actually reading the book, would I DNF it? I would not continue with the series, and I would not continue reading this book if it was a full-length novel. So it's getting 1 star. So this book is set in a world where Fae have come into the human world and have turned it into night, like an everlasting night. And then they went back to the Fae world, and now they come to the human world and like get them to like farm for them, get them to create clothes for them, and then they come and like take it back to the Fae world. So this girl that we follow, her family have this farm where they grow these like Fae apples, and then one day the Fae King comes and he's like, oh, the apples are shit, so I'm just going to take your daughter. And then it's obviously like a romance between her and the Fae King, and I forget what like the overall adventure aspect of the plot was. I think it's just kind of like bringing 2 worlds together, but it just was really boring, really boring. I think if you're going to write a serialized series like that, you have to make the first book interesting and gripping, and it just wasn't. The main character was everything that I hate in female characters in fantasy romance. She was every single trope. She was Bella Swan in a new skin. Like, I wasn't here for it. I just could not bring myself to care about her. She could have died and I would have been like, oh brilliant, hopefully we'll get a new main character now. The male love interest was also like every male love interest in any fantasy book. He was basically like a shitty version of Rhysand. So I just was like, there's nothing unique about this. There's nothing interesting about this. I don't like the characters. I don't like the writing style. I don't like the plot. The one thing I will say this book had going for it was the world building was quite interesting. The magic system overall was quite interesting, but not enough that I cared to continue. So moving on to my 2-star reads. The first one I have is If Cats Disappeared from the World, and I feel a bit sad that I'm giving this book 2 stars. I thought this would be like a really high rated book for me. I didn't go into this with 5-star expectations, but I definitely thought it would be like a high 3, possibly 4, and I didn't enjoy it. So this book follows, I don't know what our main character is called actually. Does he even have a name? So in this book we are following a guy who has recently been diagnosed, I think, with cancer, and he basically finds out that he has 1 day left to live. He is approached by the devil, who makes a bargain with him. If he lets one thing disappear from the world, then he will have 1 more day. Now there are things that I think are really interesting in this book. It definitely made me think about the importance of certain things that you think might have a huge effect if they went missing actually have very little effect, and there are other things that you might think are of very little importance to society, or you might even think they have a negative impact on society, which actually help us to connect and be a lot closer because we have them. So that aspect of the book was really interesting, but I hated reading this story. The way that this is written is just tedious. It's so boring. I'm sorry to say that, but it was boring. We get just these lengthy descriptions of things that we don't need. And I think that's something that I personally really just don't like in books, is when we're just spending like 2 hours describing this one thing, and I'm like, for God's sake, can we move on? It was particularly prominent in this book because we would get literal descriptions of films, so detailing the story of a film. And I don't want to read about a film that I could just Google and find out what that film was about if I cared to. I don't need that amount of depth in this tiny book. This is only like just 200 pages, I think. Yeah, 202 pages. I don't need that amount of detail in something that's not really relevant to the plot in this tiny book because it's tiny. It was very disappointing how little I enjoyed this. I was reading this again for Becca's Bookoplathon, and I think if I hadn't been reading it for a readathon, I would have DNF'd it. And I'm actually surprised that I didn't just DNF it anyway because I was not having a good time reading it. I do think that this is definitely a personal opinion on this book, and it personally didn't work for me. It might be a book that other people can enjoy, but those people are not me, and I don't really know who those people are. I don't know what other kinds of books they read. But if you enjoyed this, then good for you. My second 2-star book is a bit of a weird one because I gave this book 2 stars because I didn't think it was a good book, but I legitimately ate it up. I loved it. This book is Corrupt by Penelope Douglas, which is the first book in her Devil's Night series. Yeah, this wasn't a good book. It wasn't a good book. So this book follows Michael and Rika, who are 2 rich white kids from New England. That's like my favourite thing in these new adult romances. I just love the ones set in New England. I don't mean the white kids, I mean the setting, New England. I just don't know why I love it. So Rika and Michael's families are best friends. They have grown up together, but Michael has always been really horrible to Rika her entire life. That being said, she has always felt this connection with him, and she's always kind of had a bit of a crush on him. So in this rich affluent town that they live in, they have this night called Devil's Night, which is the night before Halloween, I think. And Michael's part of this gang of rich boys who do what they want and just fuck shit up. The bad boys, the rich bad boys. In England, we have these like public school boys who are known to be like so toxic. They come from the wealthiest families, they go to the best schools, and they are known to just be degenerate. Our prime ministers are part of these boys clubs, and that is basically what Michael is. I mean, not quite as bad because he's not like raped or murdered anyone. Not saying the Prime Minister has, but I'm not sure he hasn't either. But he's definitely cut from that cloth of not giving a fuck about people because he's so rich and privileged and being able to get away with all kinds of stuff because of it. That's something I don't like in these books. I really don't like these rich, toxic guys who just get away with everything, but it's fine because, as I said, I just really enjoyed this book. So they have this one Devil's Night where Rika goes with them and the guys are getting into all kinds of mischief. Something happens and the crimes of Michael's friends end up getting exposed and they end up in prison, and they all believe that Rika is to blame for this. We then have a future timeline where the guys are trying to get revenge on Rika for what they believe that she's done, and obviously her and Michael fall in love in the process. So this book, what can we say? So the main issues that I had with this book, other than like how toxic it was, which I always talk about this when I talk about romance, and I don't mind toxic romances. In some ways I actually prefer them, but when they're not done well, I think they can detract from the book, and I think that was the case with this book. There was no reason for Rika to be attracted to Michael other than like he's hot. There was nothing, they had nothing in common. They had no chemistry. I believe she had more chemistry with other characters in the book, and it just didn't make any sense, but yet they were like unable to resist each other. So all I can think of is they're both just really hot. It wasn't very well written. For some reason in this book, Penelope Douglas, and I've actually noticed it throughout the series because I've read on from this book now, she just uses a lot of names of songs, and I don't find that to be a very good writing technique. Especially as I don't know a lot of the songs that she talks about. So it just feels very alienating to me. Because I'm like, she's like, oh, we were listening to this song in the car. And I'm like, well, I don't know what song that is. I'm not going to go and look it up because you've already mentioned like 7 songs in the past 2 chapters. I just think it would be better to describe the mood of the music, or even just the genre would give us more of an insight into like what the purpose is of it. But even so, like, I don't know, it's just very odd. I mean, she's obviously like a really big music fan, but it's just an odd way of writing that I've not ever seen before, and I certainly am not a fan of. It was also really cringy. Their interactions were just like, the whole time I was just like, oh no. It wasn't good. It wasn't good. If you've read Birthday Girl and Punk 57 and Credence and you're like, oh, I want to go visit her backlist, I don't know that's necessarily the best idea, because I think objectively they are a lot worse than those books. But I still wanted to pick up the next book in the series, and I'm now on the 3rd book. So it was 2 stars because it wasn't a good read. But then I just really liked it. So I don't know. I don't know. I can't explain it. I can't explain it. So the final book that I'm going to talk about in this section of the video is Remote Control. I'm going to leave my second 3-star book for the other video because that book I rated a lot higher, and so we'll have this video with my kind of low rated books and the other video will be my high rated book. So Remote Control, another book that I read for Bookoplathon, and whilst I don't think this book was on my 5-star predictions, it was a book that I did shortlist to go onto that video, so I did expect to rate this very highly. So Remote Control is a sci-fi set in a futuristic, I believe it's Nigeria. I will check that. So I can't find if it is set in a futuristic Nigeria or not, but the author is Nigerian American, so I would assume that that is correct. So Remote Control is about a girl, I forget her name. It's about a young girl who found a seed that fell out of the sky, and this seed gives her special abilities to kill people. And then one day someone steals the seed, and so she is then like walking through Nigeria trying to be reconnected with the seed. This is going to be a really short summary of this book. I didn't get it. It went over my head. I just could not get what the story was about. Even that synopsis that I've just given you, I don't know if that's right. Me and this book could not find a middle ground where we could connect to one another. It was one of those stories where it's not really a story, like, you know, you have like your middle, your beginning and your end, and they're all like, it's a journey, it's an arc. This was just like a girl wandering around, just like what happened to her while she was on her wanderings. I don't get what the point of it was. It was well written. I like the imagery of this futuristic Nigeria. I like the technology aspect. I just didn't like the plot. The little girl character, loved her, thought she was great, but the plot just wasn't it for me. Now, one thing to say is I went into this expecting something that was more dystopian, or maybe like more of a reflection on the evolution of human society, and that isn't what it is. It is alien sci-fi, and that is a genre that I'm not interested in. I don't read anything really set in space, like Illuminate, that's it. Space sci-fi and me, there's no interest there. So that may have been part of the reason that I just didn't get a great feeling from this book, is that it's just not my genre. But yeah, it just wasn't the one for me. So I'm gonna wrap up this video here. So these were the books that I didn't love in March, as well as some unrated books and some DNFs, and you know, you just watched it, so you know what I just talked about. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Please leave me your favourite love heart emoji in the comments down below so that I know you were here. Give this video a like if you liked it, and subscribe if you want to see more from me in the future, and hopefully you will come back and see me in part 2. Bye!